What's up, painters? It's the time we've all been waiting for. Well, okay, what I've been waiting for. Time to start my Old World dwarfs. As you can see, I'm starting with 20 Dwarf Warriors, and I've undercoated them all purple. This is Midnight Purple from Vallejo over a grey Seer base. I applied the purple with my airbrush. Well, let's get to it. The first step is the chainmail, which I'm using plate mail from Army Painter for. I'm not quite doing a dry brush for this. I've heard people call this an overbrush. Basically, I'm pulling the brush across the model and not letting it fall into the recesses. I want the purple to still be showing in the recesses. Every new army I start, I try to incorporate a new technique. I think it's a great way to keep improving. For this army, I'm trying something I've seen some other YouTubers do. I want a unifying shadow colour across the entire army, so the only shadow colour I'll be using is purple. I also thought I'd time how long each step takes me, then I can share with you guys how long it takes me to batch paint these 20 warriors up to a standard that I'm happy with. This plate mail step took me 34.5 minutes, 1 minute 43 per model. The next step is blocking in the red, and I'm using Vampire Red for the base colour. I'm leaving the purple showing in the deepest recesses to act as our shadow colour. I plan to block in all the colours first, then come back and do the highlighting. This is how I normally like to paint because it's easier to fix mistakes if you've not done the highlighting yet, and I most commonly make mistakes when I'm doing the blocking in. At this point, I will mention I do not enjoy batch painting. I honestly can't remember the last time I batch painted more than 5 models at the same time. It feels like every step takes so long and you're making no progress at all. But Old World armies run so many more models than most 40k or AOS armies, so I know I need to batch paint if I'm ever going to get my army ready for the table. The red took a couple of layers to get a nice coverage, and in the end it took me 2.5 hours or 7.5 minutes per model. Next, I used Dark Sky for the blue, doing the same thing as the red and leaving the purple showing in the shadows. If you've watched any of my Votann videos, this colour scheme will be very familiar, and there are 2 reasons I decided to go with this scheme. Firstly, when I was 10, my very first Warhammer army were dwarfs for Warhammer Fantasy, and 10-year-old me picked a red and blue colour scheme and had a grand image in his head of the army looking amazing on the tabletop. Unfortunately, 10-year-old me was a terrible painter and couldn't do that image justice, but that image never left me, and today I'm a good enough painter to do it justice. The second reason I decided to go with red and blue is I thought it might be cool to tie my Votann and dwarfs together. I haven't fleshed the idea out yet, but I'm thinking something along the lines of this clan's elders tell stories about sailing through the skies on great ships until they were caught in a terrible storm and crashed on this planet, where they found and integrated with the dwarfs that they found on this planet. I think it's a fun idea. I have no idea what I'll name their clan yet. If you have any suggestions for the clan name, I'd love it if you drop them in the comments. Thankfully, the blue covered over the purple much easier, so this step was a bit quicker. The blue took me around 1.5 hours or 4 minutes 40 per model. Next were the beards. I split the dwarfs up into 5 groups of 4 to get a variety of beards in the unit. I think having some variety in a unit makes them look a lot more interesting, giving them some individuality while they still obviously belong to the unit and the army as a whole. So the first beard colour I used was Chaotic Red. It's a nice reddish brown that I think works well for beards and hair. The Chaotic Red took 22.25 minutes, or 5.5 minutes per model. Next I wanted a blondish beard, so I broke out Desert Yellow. This wasn't covering well, so needed a couple layers, and it took almost 40 minutes, or almost 10 minutes per beard. Then I wanted a blackish beard. I didn't want pure black, so I used Necromancer Cloak. This took 28 minutes, 7 minutes a model. And then some dark brown beards. For that it was Oak Brown. These beards are close in colour to the Chaotic Red beards, but the Chaotic Red has enough of a red tone that I feel like they read differently. These took just over 20 minutes or 5 minutes a beard. For the final beards, I wanted a lighter brown and settled on Monster Brown, which took 36 minutes or 9 minutes to model. In total, the beards took 2 hours, 25 minutes and averaged just over 7 minutes each. Then it was time for the leathers. I grabbed leather brown and applied this to the gloves and boots. Some models have bags on their belts, and that also got the brown. I could have done the belts brown too, but I decided I'd rather leave them as red. I'm sure you've noticed by now, but I failed to mention it earlier. I left all the shields, the banner, and the musician's instrument off to make painting easier. I'll get to them later. The leather took 2 hours, or about 6 minutes a model. It was around now that I started to realise just how big a project I had given myself. I spent 9 hours painting in one day and hadn't even finished blocking all the colours in yet. However, it was only around 27 minutes a model, so if you look at it that way, it wasn't too bad. It was a new day and new colours to block in, so I started doing the faces. My original plan was to do a variety of skin tones across the unit to bring some more individuality in, but there's such little skin on them that in the end I just decided it wasn't worth it. So they all got hit with Barbarian Flesh. If I do Slayers or other models that have more flesh, I'll definitely use a variety of skin tones there. Blocking in the faces took me 48 minutes or around 2.5 minutes each. Then it was time to block in the medals. I broke out plate mail again and started blocking it all in. The weapons and the rims of the helmet all got hit with it. I also did the handles of the weapons. At first I planned to do them wood, but I realised wood would be rare down in the clan hold, while metal would be plentiful. I couldn't imagine them using wood for things like their weapon handles when they would need it for more important things like their war machines. In total, the plate mail took 2 hours, 6 minutes each. Next was the copper. For this I used hammered copper from Vallejo. I'm not a metal expert, so this could be wildly wrong, but I'm painting models that belong to a fantasy realm, so don't call me out in the comments, or I will cry. But I decided the copper would be a softer metal for my army, and in that case I'd use it in places that the dwarfs would use a softer metal. So things like their medals, runes, and pendants all got hit with the copper. The models that had horns on the helmets also got them done copper, and to make the unit champion stand out a bit more, the rim of his helmet was done copper. This step took an hour and a half, 4.5 minutes a model. Now I needed to shade the beards, but I wanted to keep the purple tone as the only shadows. So I grabbed purple tone and contrast medium and made a 50-50 mix to start with. I used the 50-50 mix on the lighter beards and slowly added a bit more purple to the mix as I moved up to the darker beards. I also hit the leather with this mix to get some shading on that. I definitely could have left the purple showing in the recesses and did the shadows that way, but I felt it would take way too long. That's the sort of thing I could see doing for individual models or showpieces, but when batch painting a unit of 20, it would just add far too much time. I want these guys to look great, but I also want to get an army painted and onto the table. This step took 33 minutes, about 1:40 each. I realised I hadn't done the headgear on the champion, so I did that next. I used red, white, and blue to create a pattern that I liked. I also highlight this later when I do the highlights. This took 26.5 minutes, and while obviously it's only done on one model, I'll be adding the time to the total for accuracy. Now, if you wanted, you could stop here, do the eyes and shields, and have a perfectly good tabletop ready unit, and it'll have only taken you 17.5 hours or 52.5 minutes per model. That's including the time to do the shields. But for me, these aren't good enough yet, so now it's on to the fun parts. And that means highlighting. I started with the reds. First was Dragon Red. I'm hitting the shoulder straps from around halfway down, making sure to move my brush in the direction that I want to be the lightest. The point where you lift your brush is where most of the paint will be deposited. So brush direction is important when you're doing highlighting. For the red on the lower body, it depended on the model. There are a number of different lower bodies, but the general rule was I started from around halfway up and dragged the brush down. The lowest parts are the parts furthest out from the body, so they're the parts that'll be in the light. The dragon red took 33.5 minutes, 1 minute 40 each. Then pure red for the final highlights, only doing the top of the shoulder straps and the bottom of the lower body parts. For parts that are sticking out a bit further, I go up a bit higher. Just go with your best judgment and it'll look good. This was 22.5 minutes, just over 1 minute each. Normally it'd be the blue next, but I realised I didn't have the blue I wanted, so the blue needed to wait for a hobby shop run. And since I was waiting for a mate so we could go together, it was onto the beards. So I split the dwarves up to their beard colours and got dry brushing. The desert yellow beards got dry brushed with Elven Flesh, taking 6 minutes total. The monster brown beards got dry brushed with a 50-50 mix of monster brown and Elven Flesh, taking a bit over 3 minutes. The chaotic red beards got dry brushed with fur brown. Fur brown is a lighter brown, but still has that reddish tint that chaotic red has, so works well. 6 minutes for this one. Then oak brown I dry brushed with monster brown, which took 4 minutes. And finally, while my mate was waiting for me to finish up, the Necromancer Cloak got a dry brushing of uniform grey, and that took 3 minutes. The total for the dry brushing of the beards was 22 minutes, or just over a minute a model. Nice and quick. Back from my trip to the hobby store, it was time to highlight the blues, and I started with deep blue. As always, we're focusing towards the top of the model, so the top half of the arms along the top curve of the helmet and the bottom half of the flap thing that comes off the back of the helmet. This step took 32 minutes, just over a minute and a half each. For the final highlights of the blue, it was time for Ultramarine Blue. This focused on the folds of the cloth, the edge of the flappy thing, and the very top curve of the helmets, just picking out the parts that the light would be hitting. This took just under half an hour or a minute 20 each. I wasn't happy with how the metal was looking and wanted to get some purple shadows showing, so I broke out my mix of purple tone and contrast medium again. I was pretty selective where I applied this because I don't want to tint all the metal purple, just the areas that would be shadowed. This was relatively quick and only took about 20 minutes, or about a minute each. Then it was time to highlight the copper. For this I used greedy gold. I'm just working around the model, picking out the raised parts and the parts that are facing upwards. There are a lot of random icons and stuff around the model, so just make sure you take your time, find them all and hit them with a highlight. This took 26 minutes, a minute 20 each. Then the metal got the same treatment with Shinning Silver, taking 22.5 minutes, just over a minute each. I'm starting to question how I made it through painting these guys. Even writing this script is a marathon. Thankfully for the rest of the army, I shouldn't have to batch paint anything bigger than 10. Even if I have a unit of 20, I think I'll break it into lots of 10. But let's continue painting. Now it's time for the eyes. The eyes on these guys are hard and I struggled with them a fair bit. They're very small and in pretty deep recesses, it just makes them hard to hit properly. But they just don't look right if you don't do the eyes, so they had to be done. The white took 15.5 minutes, 45 seconds each. For the pupils, I don't like using pure black. I find it's too stark and doesn't look right, so I used Necromancer Cloak. I carefully just applied a dot, and once that dot was on, I didn't mess with it. I did my best to make sure they weren't cross-eyed or anything, but I wasn't going to mess around with them once the dot was on there because I'd just mess it up. This took 10 minutes, 30 seconds a model or 15 seconds an eye. Now it's time to highlight the faces. I also used this step to tidy up the eyes a bit, though honestly, much later I still wasn't happy with the eyes and did another pass at fixing them up. For the face highlights, I used a mix of Barbarian Flesh and Elven Flesh. I picked out the cheekbones and the noses, taking almost 8 minutes, or around 25 seconds a nose. For the models where we can see the mouths, I watered down some pure red and used it almost as a wash just to give some red tone to them. I also used this watered down pure red just to touch the tips of the noses. Dwarfs are supposed to have rosy noses. This took 7 minutes, about 20 seconds per nose. I'm almost done with the dwarfs themselves and thought, wrongly, that the finish line was within sight. So it was time to highlight the leather. Now I didn't highlight the leather bracer on the arm that would be holding the shield. This is going to be shadowed by the shield and not be catching any light. I used a mix of leather brown and elven flesh and it took about 18 minutes, almost a minute each. Some of the helmets have gems and the final step before moving on was to do them. I started by painting them Necromancer Cloak, then Greenskin on the bottom half of the gems. I'm rushing through this part a bit, but if you guys would like a better guide on doing the gems, let me know and I'll spend some time on it and put something out. Then it was a dot of snake scales in the middle of the greenskin. And then on the opposite side of the gem, a small dot of white. And the gems took 14 minutes. Finally, it was time for the shields. I decided to leave the shields on the cardboard stick thing that I blue tacked them to for airbrushing. This made it far easier to handle them during this part. I started by doing the back of the shields with hammered copper. I did 2 thin coats for this to get nice coverage on the flat surfaces. This took 19 minutes, almost a minute shield. Then I did the gloves with leather brown, taking 11.5 minutes, about 30 seconds per hand. Next, it was time for the purple tone mix again. I actually wanted this to pool a bit. Realistically, no one would probably see it, but the back of the shields would be in shadow, so some pooling would make it look better. 4.5 minutes total here. For working on the front of the shields, I glued them all to the models. This will not only make it far easier to handle, but it'll make it easier to find the middle point when I'm splitting the shields, and obviously easier to know where to put the highlights later. The musician and standard bearer don't have shields, so there are 18 shields in the unit. I decided this would be another place to get some variety into the unit, so I split them into 6 groups of 3. And first it was a half red and half blue shield. And then I flipped that. Then it was a full red and a full blue. And then I did quarters. And then flipped them too. The red for the shields took 44 minutes, a bit over 2 minutes each. The blue took 23 minutes because it covers much better, 1 minute 10 each. The shields have made me think about trying to find a different red. The vampire red is not covering well over the purple, and it's possible that it's because it's an old army painter paint, and they're known for not always having the best coverage. I'll have to think about it. Now it was time to highlight the shields, which was a pretty quick step. If you're just looking for tabletop quality, you could skip this and just do the copper. That's what I did when I worked out how long it would take if you skipped the highlighting earlier in the video. We're following the same recipe as earlier, so dragon red first at 4.5 minutes. Just highlighting the curve of the shield from around halfway down. Then it's pure red, just hitting the top curve of the shields. It's important to take the highlight right up to the line, otherwise later, once the blue is done, it'll look weird because you'll have a dark line down the middle of the highlight. The pure red took 6 minutes. Then the blue is following the same steps as the red, with the same recipe as the blue earlier. So deep blue for the first layer, following the curve from around halfway up the shield, taking 8 minutes. then Ultramarine Blue for the final highlight on the top of the curve. And that took 4 minutes. Now it was time to block in the copper on the shield. You definitely want to take your time blocking in the icons on the shield and try to avoid any mistakes. I probably should have blocked this in before doing the highlighting on the red or blue, just to make any mistakes easy to fix. But luckily, you can learn from my mistakes and do it in the right order. This was a pretty long step and took an hour and 10 minutes, just over 3.5 minutes each. Then we were once more back to the purple tone mix again. I ran this over all the copper, focusing it towards recesses and shadowed areas. I also ran a layer of it over the bottom quarter of the shield just to darken it a bit and help with the shadows. This only took 24 minutes. Finally, it was time to highlight the copper on the shields. Again, for this, I picked up the greedy gold. Along the rim of the shields, I went around a quarter of the way down. On the icons, I picked out the raised parts and the parts that are facing upwards, just helping to build the highlights and give it some definition. This step only took 16 minutes, about 50 seconds a shield. Now I get to let you all on a little secret. I forgot to do the horn and banner alongside everything else, and had to go back and do them from scratch. Combined, they took me almost 2 hours. I'm not entirely sure why it took that long, it certainly doesn't feel like it should have, but it did, and I've added the time. And we're done! 24 hours, 55 minutes, and 13 seconds. That sounds like such a long time, and it definitely felt like it while I was doing the painting. It did only end up being 7.5 hours longer than the point I recommended stopping if you only want to do tabletop standard, but I think the extra time was well worth it and the models look good. It worked out to only be 1 hour, 14 minutes, and 46 seconds a model. I think 1.25 hours is perfectly reasonable for these guys. The time was put to good use, and I think they look great. I'm already looking forward to the day I have my army painted on the table, and I think 10-year-old me would be proud. But I think for the next video, I won't be doing a unit. I think it's time for a break. Maybe I'll do one of the war machines or something. If you've made it this far, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you wanted to join me as I paint up more of my old world dwarfs, hit the subscribe button. And if you did enjoy the video, please drop a like. Catch you in the next video.